You need to stop playing your melodies like this and start playing them like this. A melody in music, which is just a single line of notes, can be made into so much more with harmony. Being able to take any melody that you can play on the guitar and learn how to harmonize it is a skill that you're going to want to have, because it allows you to take any of these notes that you're playing and fill them up with all sorts of different musical context, which you can decide in the moment that you're playing that song. It's how you can take melody and contextualize it to make it really sound beautiful. How are you supposed to exactly do this? We first need to understand that harmony in music is just another word for chords. You need to know what chords you're going to place around these melody notes if you're going to make these decisions about how to contextualize your music. Let's take that simple melody note that I played a little bit earlier from Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. I just played it starting on the E note, which you can play on the open E string or with this 5th fret, and you just play that twice. The 7th fret on the E, then the 9th fret, and back to the 7th fret. It's a really basic melody that you could continue down farther. When you're harmonizing melody notes, that is, applying chords to your melody, you need to understand what you're trying to achieve. If you just try to do random chords and place them with your melody and play them at the same time, it could sound great, but it could also sound awful. The structures that we use for music are keys, which is our way of grouping a set of chords together that we know sound good and provide certain kinds of traditional musical context. So if you can take your melody notes and try to place them within a key, which normally most melodies are played within the groupings of a scale, or when I say the word key, you understand that I'm just talking about a note that is the resolving note of the piece, you can probably find a way to look at the notes that you have in Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and pick a surrounding key that implements all of those notes. You might, for example, notice that all of these notes here are within that E major scale. You may also notice that the first note of the melody is on E and the last note of the melody is on E. It seems like we have a center of gravity towards the E note and we have this E major scale, so I might put this melody in the key of E major, at least the way that I'm playing it here on the guitar. And once I know this and I'm able to take my notes and place it within a scale, I'm able to do so many things. This is where I can start to pick my chords that I can use to surround these notes. And there's two ways that you can really go about it. I really think the first method might be the most fun, which is to try to take any of the chords that you know in the key of E major and look to see if they share a note with the note of your melody. Because if the melody is already in the chord, you're really recontextualizing it to fit that chord in the best way. For example, this E note that we start on is part of an E major chord, and the E major chord is part of the key of E major, so all of those line up together, which means when I play this E note, if I just play an E major chord around it, I should get a nice harmony context that doesn't really fight or mess with the note's purpose. I can do that for every one of the notes in this piece. If I go into the next note, I notice that I have a B up here, which is also still part of the E major chord. That means I don't have to change chords if I don't want to. I can play a melody and a harmony that sound just like this. And the context is there. But there are other chords that do contain that note, so you might want to mess around and see what you like. By doing this method of experimentation following the notes, you'll be able to find a bunch of interesting ways of harmonizing your notes that might not be typical, and it might not be necessarily what you expected when you started with. You notice that this E note is also part of the C sharp minor chord, which is in the key of E, and knowing that that could be an option for the first note, you may have started there instead of with E major, and so you would have gotten this sound instead. Which sounds great and supports the note, but might not be the vibe that you were going for, because we're playing a minor chord over Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, which makes it sound pretty dark. In fact, this is a fun way to try to play a progression that's normally bright sounding and turn it into a really sad version of that song. By sticking with just the triad versions of chords, you only have 7 choices of chords, and not all of them are going to contain notes in the melody. When you're analyzing a note like E or B and trying to add a chord around it, then it's pretty easy because there's not that many choices of notes within the key of E major that contain the E note, because there's not that many triads that contain the E note in the key of E major. It's a process of elimination where you can go through all of the chords that do contain that E and decide which one you like the best. Let's move on to method number 2, because normally when you're harmonizing something, what you want to be thinking about more than just the individual chords that contain the note is also the movement of the piece. And we define movement in 3 different categories: what we call a tonic, what we call a subdominant, and what we call a dominant, which are 3 roles that musical movements fall into. A tonic chord should feel like home. It should feel relaxed and resolved, like the music is at rest, which normally is what we do at the start of a song and at the end of the song. So when we're in the key of E major, the E major chord provides a tonic sound. It's the sound of resolution, the sound of home, and your home base is where you step off and do other chords. A subdominant chord is a chord that moves you away from home while providing you an avenue to sort of explore different sounds within the scale. There's a lot of chords that could fall into that category. Once you have that third category, a lot of these will fall into place. In the key of E major, the A major chord is a great example of a subdominant. It's the sound of a chord that takes you away from that E major chord and brings you towards the rest of the journey of whatever piece that you're trying to play. So when we're trying to move the piece along, we're looking at that chord roll. Maybe we start from home, but we notice that it moves out, and maybe I'd like to outline that with an A major chord, which has that subdominant roll. I can choose to resolve the music when we go back to that B for an even better effect. The last role that we place our categories of music into is dominant, which is the sound of tension. It's something that we need to provide relief before we go back to the tonic a lot of the time. These three roles, the tonic, which I feel like represents home, the subdominant, which I feel like involves you stepping out of home, and now the dominant, which I feel like provides tension before you go back to home, are the three categories that you can place almost every piece of music and movement into. We need to find the moment in the song where we feel the most tension and to try to supply a dominant sounding chord to that particular progression. Now, how do we decide which chords are tonics, which are subdominants, and which are dominants? Well, all of this has been laid out before and studied. It has to do with the notes within these chords and how they relate to each other and the way that our ears perceive them in relationship to whatever our starting chord is. So put very simply, you can memorize that within the 7 chords of a key, the very first chord of your key is a tonic chord. The second chord of your key is a subdominant chord. The third chord of your key is a tonic chord. The fourth chord is a subdominant chord. The fifth chord is a dominant chord. The sixth chord is a tonic chord. And finally, the seventh chord is also a dominant chord that provides a lot of tension before you go back to home. So by memorizing these roles, you can then look at the notes that you're playing in the melody and the way you want the piece to move. You want it to start off at home, maybe, sometimes. Maybe you'd like for it to move out of home and come back for a nice resolution. We need some tension for the climax of the song. And we need finally a chord to resolve and rest as our last and final note. By thinking of progressions these ways, you can try to smartly harmonize your chords by listening to the music and controlling the movement of those chords. Trying to find the roles is a very important way to harmonize what you're doing on guitar, especially if you're trying to create chords on a piece that never had chords or a melody that you're making up yourself. Let me know what you think of this lesson, and if you want to see more, you can head over to my Patreon page at patreon.com/willash, or support me by listening to my original music with all the links that you can find in the description. You can find the full long-form video on my YouTube channel at officialwillash. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you for the next one.